Welcome. Welcome to Chalmers Presbyterian Church acknowledges that we are located on the traditional lands of the Attawandaron peoples and territories associated with various treaties. Ananishbeg, Haudenosaunee, Lenawepayak, the Attawandaron people once settled this region alongside the Algonquin and the Haudenosaunee peoples and used this land as their traditional beaver hunting grounds. In London, our treaties include the 1796 London Township Purchase, or Treaty 6, and the 1822 Longwoods Purchase, or Treaty 21. The London Township Treaty was the regional treaty signed by diplomats representing all parties living on the land, which today we know as southwestern Ontario. Longwoods Treaty was signed by representatives of the Crown and the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and covers approximately 583,000 acres of land. Locally, there are 3 First Nation communities. They are the Chippewas of the Thames, the Oneida Nation, the Moosonee Delaware Nation. We would also like to recognize the growing Indigenous urban population comprised of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. We value the significant historical and contemporary contributions of local and regional First Nations and all of the original peoples of Turtle Island, also known as North America, and acknowledge the traditional lands upon which we live, work, and tell stories together. Welcome to ReconciliACTION, presented by London Presbytery, Lambton West Middlesex Presbytery, and Huron-Perth Presbytery. Now, please take note, there are collection plates at the back, I believe. We will have a free will offering, and all proceeds will go to the Hummingbird Ministries. We'd like to thank Reverend Andrew Thompson for hosting this event. He is the minister at this church and will be opening our ceremonies with a prayer.
Thank you, Wanda. It's a delight to be here with you today and to welcome the 3 presbyteries represented as we come together for this special event. And we're also honored to have our moderator, the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, Mary Fontaine, with us today as she shares. So again, welcome, and housekeeping note that some have wondered about the facilities, washroom facilities. If you enter the church building, they're directly on your right, just before you enter into the narthex. So let us begin with a word of prayer. Let us pray. Eternal Creator, Maker of all things, we thank you for this opportunity to gather with our 3 Presbyterians, our Indigenous sisters and brothers, to listen to stories of human suffering, stories of transformation, stories of hope. We pray that you would enable us in this time, together in this sanctuary. Let this be a safe place to hold these stories with compassion and grace. Spirit, we invite you to come to lead us into truth and empower us today to work toward reconciliation in our communities, in our world. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen.
Our first speaker is going to be Reverend Gwen Ament. Now, Gwen is newly retired after 27 years of ministry with the PCC, and most recently, having served in St. Mary's, Ontario. She served as the chair of the board of the Saskatoon Native Circle Ministry, completed the Returning to Spirit Healing and Reconciliation program while serving at St. Andrews in Saskatoon. Gwen attended the 2018 Parliament World Religions in Toronto, which has a major focus on reconciliation. Welcome, Reverend Gwen.
Well, I just said thank you to Wanda, and it's an honor to be here, a privilege, certainly. Welcome to the Reverend Mary Fontaine. We were just connecting again over the times that we've already been together, and so that's great. When the planning team was appointed for this particular event, one of the first things we struggled with was, well, how do we name this? What do we say? And there was a lot of brainstorming, and eventually we came to the title of From Reconciliation to ReconciliACTION. And it's a challenging thing. If you're anything like me, you're thinking all the time, well, how can I make a difference? Is there anything I can do? For myself, I was at the very opening of the Truth and Reconciliation talks. There was a big gathering in Ottawa, and a friend, a colleague in the United Church said, I'm going to go down to that. Why don't you come? And I didn't really even know what it was about, but she's a good friend. I thought, well, if she's going, I'm going to go too. And so I went. And it was a very interesting thing because it was there was a celebration of sorts at the end with the Indigenous people leading us in a large sort of circle dance. And I just can't imagine. When I attended the Parliament of the World's Religions, which Mary was also attending, I had the great honor to attend a workshop. It wasn't supposed to be Chief Robert Joseph. He was supposed to be introducing the speaker, but somehow the speaker didn't show up. And so Chief Robert Joseph shared his story with all in attendance. And I've never understood this. My grandfather would take us to the powwows that were held at Six Nations, and he's gone. I don't know why he took us. I'm glad that he did. And then when I was in Thunder Bay, I would go to Fort William to the powwow there. And I've always thought, it's interesting, when regalia, or as white people like to refer to them, the costumes that the Indians wear, come out, everybody's all interested and excited to go. And it seemed to me like that was the only time we were interested. And then as the Truth and Reconciliation talks happened, and as the years have unfolded, there's been opportunity after opportunity for me to develop a better understanding of what took place. So when I was thinking about this title that the team ended up with, Reconciliation to ReconciliACTION, I thought we really need to make sure that we have some of that as a feeder for us. So in 2021, as we were in the midst of COVID, the news broke in May of that year about the unmarked graves, some of the first unmarked graves that were found. And I struggled as a minister and as a person. How do you respond to that? And so Friday I was thinking about that, Saturday, and I went down to the local Canadian Tire and I bought rolls of orange flag tape, and before worship on Sunday morning I began to tie orange ribbons on our hand railings outside. And it was a small act, and it was just me. Subsequently, as we learned, there were others who joined me in tying orange ribbons. And you can think, it's just a small thing. And then later on, as the year unfolded, there was a time I was sitting out on the front steps. There was a group of us who were making a video recording of the church's confession, and that's available through the PCC. And there was a gentleman who stopped, and he was looking at all of the orange ribbons. And he had a conversation with me. He's speaking about how important it was for him to see these orange ribbons just blowing there in the wind. We acknowledge the tragedy that is there with that story and how important it is to learn and to grow in our understanding. Another month later, a teacher who was teaching from home during COVID spoke to her class online. She asked them what they do in their little break, to get off of the screen. And she said, on my break, I walked around the block and I came across these orange ribbons hanging in front of this church. And she said, there's a bench there. I sat and I reflected on it. And she said, my heart was filled with sorrow, but it's important that we hear these stories and that we expand our learning and understanding. And then from that same simple act of hanging those ribbons, I received in Messenger from a woman I had never met before, but who lived in the community of St. Mary's. She's since passed. And she thanked me for that display. She and her brother had been born into a family where the mother was Indigenous and the father was a settler. And it ended up that the family split, and she went with the father and her brother went with her mother. And her brother ended up in residential school. And she shared all of this story with me, just in words on Messenger. And the challenge that she and her brother had had to understand each other. And she felt terrible because her brother had tried to tell them what was happening at the time, and no one would listen. And then as part of the Truth and Reconciliation hearings that took place, he was invited to share his story, and not long after that, she said he committed suicide. So there she was, thinking about these orange ribbons and sharing from such a place of vulnerability. And I remember saying to Chief Joseph at the time of the World Parliament, how fortunate we are. I said, I can't believe the more I learn about how settler people treated Indigenous peoples. And yet Indigenous peoples are still willing to sit and share their stories with us and work towards reconciliation. They owe nothing to us. And yet time and time again, they make themselves very vulnerable in sharing these stories. So ReconciliACTION, Indigenous peoples have been working on this, and trust me, it's around the world. There's Indigenous peoples in every country. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about Finland or Brazil or Australia. Somehow, the history tells us that if you're Indigenous, you've been oppressed and tried to be extinguished from life. So what do? Well, on some days, we take time to tie orange ribbons. On some days, we may read a book, and one of the resources that you picked up was a compilation, because what ended up happening at my congregation was that in the fall of 2021, a small group of us felt like we needed to create space for conversation to happen. And so, yes, in the midst of COVID, a new group started called Space Makers. And one of the first projects that we had was, how do we share knowledge? And we worked with a local Indigenous leader, Patsy Ann Day of the Oneida clan. And we had 4 live video sessions focusing on various aspects: the history, the language, the culture, and ways to learn. And each video included ways that people could grow in their understanding. So from one little action of tying those first orange ribbons, much has resulted. And when we were coming to this morning, I said, you know, I think we should have a takeaway for people, so this is here for you. It is by no means an extensive list. It has some different books and whatnot, some websites, things that to help you find your way. One of the people working on the Indigenous side of reconciliation is Sandy Boucher out of Thunder Bay, and she likens the journey to the feather, and she said a feather has two sides. Indigenous people are working on their side, and we as settler people need to work on our side. And we're doing that parallel, much like the original Wampum Belt Treaty, traveling in the same direction, but with respect. There is so much for us to learn and grow and understand in. And I say it again, how blessed and fortunate are we that there are Indigenous people who are still wanting to share their knowledge and understanding and make themselves vulnerable enough for us to be able to do our work that we need to do on reconciliation to ReconciliACTION. It's not a point of arrival, it's a way of living. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Now, Kathleen, I'm going to pronounce your name wrong, and I'm sorry. Lichi? Lichty. Okay. Is the program director at London Indigenous Teaching and Sharing Circles, a retired high school teacher, trained facilitator, spiritual director, and now presently involved in Indigenous issues as she is able. After a very serious brush with death, Kathleen was privileged to make a blanket exercise. After that, her life changed radically and became involved in being an ally in presenting blanket exercises, helping Kairos, to coordinate KBE teams and Kairos sharing. Her facilitation training and experience led to further training and in presenting the blanket exercise, even coaching and mentoring. This has deepened the conviction and passion to tell the story as it really happened when the land of Canada was colonized. The need for reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in Canada is urgent, particularly considering the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report in 2015. This is what inspires, motivates, and urges Kathleen to use her skills, talents to sow the seed of reconciliation. In Kathleen's bio, there is a line that is just so moving and incredible. It is education that got us into this, and it is education that is going to get us out. Kathleen. Where is Kathleen? There you go.
Gloria is a very take-charge person. And I noticed many of you must have Catholic blood in you because you're sitting at the back. Anyway, Gloria will introduce herself as only she can do. And we only have 10 minutes each, so I'm going to... Go ahead, Gloria, take it away.
I'm not sure how to hold the microphone because I don't want you to miss a word. Is this better? Because often there's an echo. This is good? Okay. Thank you, Gwen. Tanshi Kiawa. Dishni Kashan Gloria Thompson. And what I've just said in the Métis language, I'm a Métis woman, the Michif language is hello, welcome, my name is Gloria. So I was born into a family with a Métis dad who never spoke the word Métis, but he spoke Michif. He told me it was French. So he lived a lie. He moved from Manitoba, where my roots are, to Thunder Bay and kind of tried to forget about all the pain and racism that he left behind. So I understand today why he didn't want to talk about it, why I was shushed, because I was very suspicious as I grew older that there were natives in our family. So I was later to learn, of course, that we were connected with Métis communities in the Northwest. So that's just a little bit about myself. I started learning about this issue through a blanket exercise. I don't know if any of you have ever done one. It is a very intense, interactive exercise that teaches the truth. So I did my first blanket exercise with this woman sitting here, Kathleen Lichty, and I was so overtaken by, as when you tried to describe about being wowed by the truth. So I became a facilitator for the blanket exercise, and Kathleen and myself and a few other Native women were involved. We always had an Indigenous knowledge keeper present whenever we did a blanket exercise. So I got to know some of these women, really amazing Indigenous women who are involved in the LITs. But now I'm jumping ahead. So eventually it was the COVID that stopped us doing the blanket exercises. So a wonderful woman named Carol Umania was working at Kairos, which is where the blanket exercise originated, suggested that we do an online teaching. So each one of us, the three, there's Tracy White-Eye, Tina Stevens, and Marianne Ketchigo, our three other Indigenous women, took turns presenting talks. My talk was about the Métis, because many people don't understand that the Métis are a distinct culture, that the Métis developed as a distinct culture. So I tried to teach that. Many people, I myself, when I was young, I didn't know anything, thought, oh, you're Métis if your dad is Native and your mom is white. No, that's not the case at all. It's a community attachment. It's a connection to that culture. I'm connected to my culture. I'm connected to my dad. I'm connected to the fiddling and the jigging and the venison that he provided for us. Even though I've had to study about my own history as an adult. So anyway, what happened then, we started teaching, like Carol Emmanuel was a wonderful, organized person, and we did lits, we did teaching circles online right across Canada. Then things changed again, and Carol had moved on from Kairos, and so Sister Kathleen here, you think she's just a sweet little old with white hair, no, she's a bulldog. She's a warrior. She said, that's not going to stop us. I think we should do it locally. So the four of us met, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of us met, and we developed the London Indigenous Teaching and Sharing Circles. So we continue to do that. And it has developed onward and upward, and I think I need to hand this over to Kathleen before she slaps me.
There's nothing going to silence Gloria. No, I have to say, when we met after we had the meeting with Kairos and realized that Kairos was not able to carry on with the Kairos teaching and sharing circles, it was the Indigenous women who said, well, we can still do this. So I can't take credit for that, Gloria. So anyway, in 2022 is when we started the London Indigenous Teaching and Sharing Circles. We don't want to get into a lot of funding to support this because we do pay an honorarium to the Indigenous presenters. So we charge $20. Well, it's $22 if you go through Eventbrite. But the purpose of the LITS circles is to be engaging. It's not just a webinar. It begins with a land acknowledgement done by one of the allies who are taking part in the event, and then a virtual presentation of a tobacco tie. In the case of the Inuit woman who just joined us, they do not take tobacco. In fact, she doesn't want anything, but we presented her last week with a tea tie. And then in the debriefing after, she said, you don't need to present me with anything. It's part of their culture. So the teaching is then done on various topics, which I'll talk about later. And then there is an hour left for sharing. And the Indigenous person then, because it's virtual, she has a list of the attendees and calls them by name, and no one is put on the spot. I don't think it's being put on the spot. When she calls them by name, would you like to say anything, or would you just, you're part of the circle. If you want to decline, that's fine. But it's important that the Indigenous person or the presider holds that circle. And it's proved to be very effective. We've been able to reach people from Newfoundland to BC. We even had somebody from the UK who heard about the lit circles. I don't know what time of day or night that person attended, but I'd also like to mention that I had the privilege also, Gwen, of being in Ottawa in 2015. Maybe we met and didn't know we did. But it was a magnificent, magnificent gathering when the Truth and Reconciliation report came out, and it was a real celebration. Back to you, Gloria.
I think our teachings really focus on telling the truth. First, it's about truth. First, to hear the true stories that have come out since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and even way back, I believe in 1996, with the Royal Commission on Indigenous People. The information has been there for a very long time. And so we hope by telling the truth and making people aware of the damage, that it opens our hearts. I think those orange ribbons opened a heart to someone passing by. And the story of that little orange shirt girl opened people's hearts. But more than anything, it was the discovery of the unmarked graves. People really, somehow, it was the knowledge that went from the head to the heart. Wow. And so that caused a motivation. Now, what did you want me to say, Kathleen? Okay, I'm going to show you the women that are involved with the LITS circle. Screen number 1. So our team consists of 4 of us, myself, the Métis woman, Tina Stevens, who is from Kettle Point Reserve, Marianne Kitchigo, who is from the Oneida, and Tracy Whiteeye, who is from the Lenape area. The number 2, 2 to 6. Can you can't read them. Okay. We're looking for photos. Slide 2 to 6. I know. Shall we just continue? Well, I've introduced the women. Hopefully, in a few minutes, we'll be able to see their photographs. So we have 4 representatives from Indigenous communities right here, right near to London. And there's so much to learn. Oh, gosh, I think I see something coming up. There's so much to learn. And these women are so knowledgeable about their history and about their recent history, surviving the survivors. So they have a lot to share. I have a lot to share too, but my knowledge is more focused toward the Métis. That's my mandate. I don't know what to do, honey.
Okay. We're sorry that you won't see their pictures, but they're 3 other very vibrant women. 4 other very vibrant women. Naulak Ledrew from Toronto just joined us this past week. She is the Inuit person who is with us now. So we have a complete representation of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit on the team. There is a copy at the back of the hall in the narthex there of the events that are coming up. So I won't go through those, except for I'd like to mention Starry Skies Through Indigenous Eyes was presented by Tina Stevens. It went very, very well, very well. And last week with Naulak talking about the Inuit way of life was a real education for all of us. I wasn't sure where she was going with it all because she talked with her hands. If she were handcuffed, she'd be speechless. It was very, very engaging. And there's Marianne. Okay, so just go through those if you wouldn't mind. And there's Tracy. And there's Tina. And there's Gloria. Everybody clap, please. I think we do. And now look, I think is the next one. There she is. There she is. Now she was not wearing that regalia the other day. She was, actually she wasn't wearing any regalia, was she, for that? Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm so glad you were able to get those pictures up. Thank you. And then now maybe if you can, the moving beyond the truths. It's after now look. Right. Tina will be doing that on January the 9th, delving into the complexities of reconciliation, exploring if it can truly be achieved, and navigate through the challenges and possibilities of moving beyond the truths of our history, and to gain a deeper understanding of the path to reconciliation. And if you go to the next slide, please, that would be the one on mental health. Tracy will be doing that one. Tracy she has her master's in social work. She does an awful lot of work with Indigenous women, murdered and missing Indigenous women survivors. And she is passionate about getting the ways of Indigenous healing out there. The rate of incarceration is far, far more for the Indigenous, and in many cases it's a case of mental health. And I think we're almost finished. Oh, no, I have to talk about the video series. The video series was put together, and I think that could be the next slide. I think I gave you one there. Okay, you can pass that. We've done the 60 Scoop survivors, okay. It will be the one, that's it. Kevin Moynihan and my community was very instrumental in helping this video series come into being. And it's 5 20-minute videos, which we have boiled down to 3 viewings of those. And at each one, we have the same protocol as for a lit circle. If you ever wanted to do that in your parish, it's a wonderful tool. You can have the Indigenous person on Zoom, and you can have an in-person for the attendees, if you wish. For example, they had it up in Barrie, and the Indigenous presiders for those videos was here in London. So they passed an iPad around among the in-person attendees so that the Indigenous person could see who was sharing. And so the video is watched by the Indigenous or presider or the Inuit or Métis person. They watch the video together. They see the truth together. That's so important, that we see this together and acknowledge what happened. And then there is a sharing circle. It's a 2-hour session, and we give the Indigenous or presider $100 if no travel is involved, and it's very manageable. And then we use another video on Stolen Land, Strong Hearts. It was put out by the Anglican Church, very well done, and it's on public domain, so we have permission to use it. And that is, we actually start with that because they talk so much about the doctrine of discovery. When Pope Alexander VI, the good Catholic Pope, said that, if you discover this land, it's yours. Well, guess what? That's changed. So the video series has proven to be extremely popular. The Children's Aid Society has done it with their staff in Oxford County. The foster parents have seen it. That's so important, and the way in which Indigenous children are put in foster homes that are hopefully will be Indigenous foster homes. So I think, Gloria, unless you want to add anything else, I just want to say I'm just really, really happy that you invited us to come here. And this woman to my left, Charlene, we've been on the phone every day, I think, for the last 2 weeks. She is a go-getter. So thank you so much. And Gloria, do you want to say anything?
You're very nice to hand me the microphone. It was so lovely to see our history up on slides, and thank you so much to the efforts of this parish, particularly to you, Charlene. And really, it was just amazing to be here with you today. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It's my understanding that the Kairos blanket exercise it's no more, like there's no way to bring that back at all, is there?
Right now, the Kairos blanket exercise is under major change. And the hope is that it will be more Indigenous run in terms of administration. And right now, they're working on an Indigenous entrepreneur can be the host for a blanket exercise. So that Indigenous person would make the team. So it's kind of difficult right now because in this area nothing seems to be happening, and we've got trained, facilitators to do it. So we're hoping that it will come back. There is a virtual one that's been. It is. There is a virtual Kairos blanket exercise, which has pros and cons to it. Okay, thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, ladies. That was so informative, and our next speaker is Sharon Lapierre. Sharon is currently serving as the clerk of Lambton West Middlesex Presbytery. Sharon was a Canadian Customs Border Services senior officer for 27 years at Sarnia, Sombra, and Walpole Island. First Nations Walpole Island is unique in that they have 7 First Nations represented in their community. It is actually a group of islands on the St. Clair River and services a car ferry between Michigan and Ontario. It is currently the only other border crossing between Sarnia and Windsor Bridges. Sharon's talk is How Did We Get to Needing Reconciliation? Sharon.
Good morning. My talk is the brutal talk. Mine is the one that tells you how we got here. When we start to look at reconciliation, how many of us really know what we're talking about? How many of us really know what are we reconciling here anyway? We know about the residential schools. We've heard various versions of how the Native child was treated. In order to understand how it all worked, you also have to understand the legislation known as the Indian Act. Created and signed in 1867, it had one purpose, and one purpose only. It was signed to assimilate the Native people into the European-led culture brought to Canada and thus eliminate the Native culture completely. When we first came to Canada, our diseases did havoc on the Native people, but they didn't wipe them out. And so the Indian Act was created. We must learn because this is how we were going to assimilate these people. First, they were declared incompetent. That's how you controlled people, make them incompetent. To be competent, you were no longer Native. Many rules were put in place, ways of declaring someone competent, so they couldn't live among their own people and they couldn't follow their own ways. One of the ways was the New Year's party. The Indian agent would call a party, or a levee, as they call it, and everyone was invited from the community, both the Native community and the white community, and they all had a party. And the real purpose of this party was so that white people would visualize a Native person taking a drink. If that person took a drink, they were declared to be competent and no longer Native, not allowed to go home. Because if you were incompetent, you could not drink alcohol. So it was a game that was played. Well, that didn't work fast enough. That only happened on New Year's. So then the agent went around to all the reserves and he did a head count once a year. And that head count would be done during the day when the men were out in the fields or out hunting or fishing, and the women were at home with the children. And it was done on purpose because the Indian agent would say, "Everybody here Native?" "Yeah, we are." "Was there anybody else?" Well, the question itself said, "Is there anybody else here?" Well, the men weren't home. So the Indian agent would only declare the people in that house as Native. Thus, the men were excluded. Women were forced to marry. To get out of poverty, they were forced to marry white men, and they lost their status and could not even go home to visit. And finally, they targeted the children. Children were to be educated and made to be competent. They were forcibly removed from their communities. In the Native community, the family looks after the children. My brother is responsible for my children. I am responsible for his children. And most of all, the wise elder is responsible for the family. They didn't understand this, and nor did they want to. They just dragged these children away and put them into residential schools. Oh, they weren't nice residential schools either. They were taken from their homes. They were taken from their security. They were taken to the residential school where they were forbidden to speak their language. They were forbidden to communicate in either anything other than French or English, depending on where they were. And the results of trying to use your own language was beatings, starvation, and death. Young girls were repeatedly raped by the very people that were supposed to be looking after them. In one home, we learn that when a new baby was born to one of these young girls, they would give the baby a beautiful gown and a lovely cap. They would wrap them in a beautiful blanket, and then they would take them down to the kitchen where they would throw them into the fire in front of the children, often their brothers and their sisters. The reality, yes, folks, that's the reality of a residential home. And if the young mother died, nobody knew, because until we found the mass graves, we didn't know where these children went. They just disappeared off the face of the earth. That was the purpose. The purpose was to end the nation. But the children went to school. They went to school to become competent. In order to become competent under the Indian Act, you had to learn to read, write, and do arithmetic, just like every other student in school. No, not just like every other child in school. According to the Indian Act, if you could read, write, and do arithmetic to the level of grade 3, you were competent, and therefore, you were no longer a native. To ensure this happened, the standard for the native child was very different. They had to learn to print and read their name, or the name they were given. They had to count to 20. And now they were competent to go out into the world, and that's exactly where they were sent. Some found their way home, and many never were found. The white child in the school, because sometimes they were in the same school, they were treated very differently, and they had a much more rigid grade 3 graduation. And so it went. But the nation was not wiped out. People found their way home, and they were destroyed. They were angry, and rightly so. Their family, their nurturing, their childhood had been stolen. Their innocence had been taken. The security of a mother's arms had been denied. After 2 world wars, where the native people stood side by side and fell side by side with the rest of Canada, there was no recognition for the native. In 1960, men and women were finally given the right to vote in a federal election without giving up their native status. The code talker, who saved many regiments from certain death, just recently got any recognition at all. The Indian Act, a piece of legislation written by nice Canadians to control and eliminate the population, was repealed in 1985, almost 100 years. The legislation, and understand this, folks, this legislation was the actual template for apartheid in South Africa. That legislation of the Indian Act. But residential schools didn't close till 1996. On June 11, 2008, Stephen Harper led Canada in an apology to our Native population, now respectfully referred to as First Nations, no longer called Indians. And so the road to reconciliation has slowly begun. In the Presbyterian Church, it's been a journey of more than 20 years of working, of where to start, how to proceed, acknowledging our valuable First Nations people, and welcoming them. We've made a good start. Took over 100 years, and the discovery of the horror of the residential graves, but it's a start. Even more important, we've started the process of making sure this never happens to another person again. And so we come to today. We share the material, we share the stories, and we share the information. We pray, and we share traditions and the foods of our First Nation peoples, and we share as Christian people united under one God. And for us, God has brought us a leader. Our moderator is of the Cree Nation, and a mentor and leader in teaching the truth so reconciliation can be moved forward to ReconciliACTION. We move forward from history to the present and the actions we are taking to move forward. I'm going to share with you a poem written by Jasper Huguenais, who is the father-in-law of Reverend Ian Marnott. It's a little bit long, but it's worth every word. I weep. I weep for the children torn from their parents, taken to a strange place for their good, isolated, mistreated, unloved, neglected, abused, and seemingly forgotten, quietly embraced by Mother Earth to preserve their memory. I weep at the suffering and the loss, young children buried in shallow graves, dug by other young children, hearing the shallow sound bites as the horror is being laid bare, lip service, apologies, while entrenched in one's place of white privilege. I weep when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report is held up as an icon that is handled like a closed book, to be displayed and then to be locked away. Unopened for fear of a power shift when taking steps toward healing. Healing that can only come by stepping away from the pedestal of power. I weep over the multi-generational hurt and abuse of lost family life, motherly nurture. Every child torn from their family at too tender an age. Torn from siblings, from home, from language, from community. I weep for those told to get over it. The callousness of the attitude toward each traumatized adult, each adult trying to get past the horrors of residential school, each adult searching for their identity to reconnect with their culture and their language. I weep when land rights are not honored, when companies use the police to usurp their interests, when informed consent needs to be demeaned by the courts and then not carried out by the rights. I weep when sacred ground is desecrated, when land is stripped of its life and resources, when life-giving land is being guarded at great personal expense, while being confronted by police and used like private agents. I weep because our country lacks vision and hope for what can be gained by turning one's back on the colonial mindset. A mindset that rapes the land, causing untold destruction, meanwhile turning one's back on seeking healing and reconciliation. I weep for the disproportionate number of Indigenous incarcerated, locked away rather than being helped, locked in a correctional institution that will not offer correction, an institution that further alienates, that further victimizes. And I weep when I hear apologies for the deeds of the past, for deeds carried out by our ancestors, many still living, by deeds done in the name of Christianity, and by deeds so misguided that there can be no excuse. I weep when I hear apologies for the deeds of the past, when the present actions just don't change. The present actions showing the same annoyance for Canada's Indigenous. Today's misguided deeds forming the apologies to be delivered by the next generation. I weep at the lack of will for change, unwilling to ease the reins of power, unwilling to concede our place, arrogance of a colonial mindset. Weeping will continue to the end of this day. Weeping will continue to the darkness of the night. Joy will come when a new day dawns, when each Canadian can truly embrace each person as a valued citizen. Joy will come when those of privilege enact change, when people of privilege stand alongside our Aboriginal Canadians, when mindset of power becomes one of heartfelt sharing, when people with power recognize that healing is the way forward. Joy will come when each Canadian is valued as an equal citizen in a country that can be a great light to the world, a country of peace, healing, and hope for the future, a country that has the potential to use the path of justice for all. Joy will come when we realize that white privilege is still alive and unwell. when we truly become a merit-based society, and when we truly give equal opportunity, when we truly love our neighbors as ourselves. Psalm 30, verse 5, weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. And so we see our fault and loss. But we also see that God has a way and a plan, and we are the instruments of that great plan. We learn each time, and hopefully in learning we will never repeat the atrocities to another living person. We are God's children, and as such we seek reconciliation, not just with our Indigenous peoples, but with all peoples. For when we accomplish this, we truly will find the joy that comes in the morning. Thank you.
Hi, Kathleen and Gloria. I want to thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us here. We would hope that you will stay, but I understand you're planning to leave. Oh, you are going to stay. Well, it's definitely appropriate. All are welcome. We definitely want you to stay. But now that I'm here, well, just fly by the seat of my pants, you know? That's what I do well. I would like to present you with this scroll. You're welcome. We have a minor little problem. Our caterer is late. So I actually would like to open the floor up for questions for any of our speakers. You're all so quiet. You really are Presbyterians.
I hope I'm not speaking out of turn here, but if the term Indian is so, like, taboo, how come Buffy St. Marie still uses it?
I don't know that we have an answer for that. I'm not sure that Indian is taboo.
I guess it depends where you live, and depends on, what you've learned so far. Thank you for letting me speak. It's because Columbus made a mistake when he came here. He thought he was in India. So he called us Indians, so we've never been Indians, unless you call us Western Indians. But it's become very, I don't know what word to use for that. It's just it gives you a bad taste in your mouth because of all the treatment that's associated with that word, of the history that's associated. Its association with the Indian Act, especially the residential schools. We are not Indians to begin with. That's not who we are. We're Nehiawak, we're Michif, we're Anishinaabe, we're Haudenosaunee, we're our own people. We have our own names for ourselves. But to include everyone, I think it was I'm not sure which year it was, but in the Indian Act, or in the, there was a clause initiated, I think it was during Trudeau's time, that included a name for all Indigenous people. They called us Aboriginal at that time. And then it was, we didn't like that name because then people associate it with Aborigines. We're not. We're Canadian Indigenous people. So then we finally just went back to Indigenous. But at first it was First Nations, but then First Nations didn't include the Métis. So, you know, I think the overall word has, at this point, is Indigenous. But if you do know the name of the people that you work with, it's better to include them or call them an Anishinaabe or Mohawk or whatever they want to be called. And it's part of reconciliation to find out for yourselves what your local people want to be called. Most people have been okay so far with being Indigenous. In the States, they call them Native Americans, and they seem to be okay with that, at least from what I know. But yeah, it's a big question. It's a good question, so thank you for asking that. But yeah.
And that can be part of a ReconciliACTION, is finding out what your most local group of Indigenous people is. In St. Mary's, the woman that I spoke about, as I said, is from the Oneida clan, the Turtle clan, the Oneida Nation. One of the learnings that came for me from Sandy Boucher online was even the term, our Indigenous brothers and sisters. That's a colonial mindset of ownership. It's not they're not our people, our brothers and sisters. They're Indigenous. But when we begin to stop and think about how we're behaving, it's as simple as just thinking, oh, right. Yeah, no, they are their own people with their own customs and their own teachings and their own learnings, which I would just say, you know, they did fine for 10,000 or so years without us. And I don't know, in 150, we've made quite a mess. But that's just, again, a small way that ReconciliACTION can happen, is heightening our awareness of those terms that are being used.
What I forgot was, it was Section 35 of the Canadian Constitution. It's what I was thinking of. It's where we were named as, we finally got included in that. And this is where they called us at that time Aboriginal. So, yeah. But we have an expert over here on the Indian Act, so just ask her.
Great. You have, I understand you have a video that we can play. 2 videos.
COVID took away my memory of my family and my life. Returning to civilization. Every day I'm living this strife. Never knowing who I could be. Government with children. What's our future gonna be? Who will teach our people? Will we ever be free? Live our lives as created meant to be. The keepers of this land are bringing back culture. Continue to take a stand against those who do not want us here in our well-made land. Culture is our power. It gives us strength, it's our identity.
So
Those videos were amazing. Mary sent those, right? Yeah. Now, there was another question back here. Who had it? Okay.
Not used to using one of these. It's amazing what the group of ladies are doing and bringing knowledge to everyone here. I'm wondering how active the men are in the community of the Indigenous with the healing process.
So who would like to take that question?
Yes, it's almost sexist in reverse, isn't it? That's a very good question. The question, Gloria, was, where are the men in the lit circles?
That's a very good question.
We're very young in terms of how we've started off. And I guess we started off by working together to do many, many blanket exercises. And it just happened to be that it was mostly women. We'll probably take that back to the group and see if we could expand our knowledge base. Thanks for the question.
It's a good question. I think of a story. I was in Mistawasis, which is where I come from in Saskatchewan, and my sister said, I want to introduce you to the radio announcer. So I said, okay. So I went to see him, and she wanted me to talk to him about my ministry in BC, and I talked to him about that. And then I said, well, you know, one of the things that I've noticed about our community and about a lot of Native communities is the men are not there for the children, and the women are raising their children on their own. Now we need the men to own up to who they were meant to be. We know that it's the women who started promoting the healing many years ago and still are. But it's because the men have been so subdued. Imagine going through, you're no longer the provider. You lost your total identity. You don't know who you are anymore. My dad went through stuff like that. He never had, he refused to give up though. He just kept hunting. He kept trying to provide for his family. If you aren't able to provide for your family as a man, can you imagine what that feels like? You are oppressed. You can't go hunting anymore. You're not able to go all around our territory. All the farmers had no trespassing sign. And if you killed an Indian, as they called us in those days, you know, you were in your full right. You had no, and it's still the same thing happening in Saskatchewan. If you kill a Native person on your land, you don't have to go to jail. You're not accountable to anybody. The law is with you. And that happened. I think the most recent one is 2010 or 11, something like that. The Bushi case. The young man was killed, and he went to court, and the farmer didn't, got away with it. So the men have been through hell and back. and are coming back, though. My little interview with the radio man, I guess I wasn't invited back because I think it hit a nerve. And on Facebook later on, I could hear these comments, oh yeah, you're just baby dad, and these guys are teasing each other. But you know what? There's a young man that started a men's group reclaiming who we are as men, as our Indigenous men. But my dad was a good example of who our men were in those days, of taking care of the family, being providers and protectors of the family, but not able to because they took our whole economy away, right? They killed the buffalo, killed everything. They just reduced us to nothing, made us poor. The Indian Act is, we're not poor for nothing. We are poor. We weren't poor before the settlers came. We were very, very wealthy. Lived off the land, totally different system, of course. No economy that we know it, no money was exchanged. It was all about trading and sharing. That was our economy, and providing for your family. So the men, I'd like to, they'll probably have their own reply, their own responses once they start having a voice in this, and I'm sure that there are voices out there. There are men who are stepping up. Joseph, what's his name? Robert Joseph there's quite a number of people, men in Saskatchewan, a lot of them get involved in political areas more than in the social areas. And I know up north, somewhere up north in Alberta, I think it was, or maybe Saskatchewan, or no, BC, where a young man was involved in helping with when they were sniffing gas and stuff like that. Yeah, I don't remember the details, but Oab Canoe now, yeah, but they're all in, not so much the social area, but in the political area, and doing their best in that, and that's not easy to do. We get so much money. The way the government reports our finances is not true. You got to get to the truth of that. There was a man called Murray Angus who tried to write a book about it a long time ago now, back in the early 90s. But it's always shushed up. It's never a big deal. You never hear about it on media. So it's a big question that I think we need to uncover. People need to look deeper. For example, some of our Indigenous lawyers, some of them women, have uncovered some funds that were put aside for Indigenous people by the Crown years ago, and that money was supposed to be used for Indigenous people, but it hasn't been. So, but anybody who speaks up, is put down, shushed up, or the story they're saying is not revealed publicly. So it's not public knowledge. Only certain people know about it. Yeah, men will have a voice, and they do have a voice, and I think, just being a baby dad is not who they were meant to be. You got to own up to having your kids, and I had to speak up, because sometimes you do have to say, you guys get with it. We need you there for your kids. Your kids need you. They need you every day. They don't need you just once in a while. But I think the men will get there. They're gradually starting to get.
That's not that unusual in a lot of cultures. Women are not recognized, but they do lead the fight, and the men follow. Is there any other questions?
How is Thames Valley education system educating the young ones on history? Has there been any change? Not that I remember much about what was taught to me when I was young in history. It was not my favorite subject. But what is being taught? What changes are made? Is there any changes being made?
That's a great ReconciliACTION question. Part of the 94 calls to action, if you haven't read them, some are very specific to churches, many are very specific to education. One of the little small acts of ReconciliACTION that I actually did was I got in touch with our town council to find out, because there are calls to action that apply to them. I'm going to encourage you to reach out to your local school board and ask that very question to them. It's amazing the kinds of things that unfold, but as soon as we start asking questions and living those calls into action, that's when changes happen.
Thank you.
In reply to the last question, I drive a school bus to an elementary school, and the children in that school are learning the history the way it actually happened. They have 2 good history teachers in the school, and they're not giving them what I learned, certainly 70 years ago. One of the kids was very upset when he was telling me a couple of years back about he'd read that they'd been finding the remains of the children. And he said that's what the fellow was talking about in school. So I think there's something happening. I think Thames Valley is maybe making some effort.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm in grade 10 right now. And so just to talk about the sort of stuff that we've been learning about, I actually have a book with me right now that I've been assigned. So I'm learning about, reading about 2 Indigenous boys written by an Indigenous author. Yeah, it's called Fire Song. Earlier in the year, we had, there was an event where there were a whole bunch of different Indigenous people talking. We were able to watch a live stream of it. There was like poetry and dancing and like different tellings of how the residential schools were. And it was really like, there was a lot of information in it, but it was also really lovely to just experience all sorts of different culture from like all around Turtle Island and North America. And then also quite recently, we had one of my teacher's friends who's Indigenous. She came in and she taught us about the 4 sacred medicines and the medicine wheel and all the sorts of like north, south, east, west, and all that sort of stuff, like those teachings. And like we did some smudging, and so I think we've been learning quite a lot about the different history and stuff recently, and it's just really nice to see. Oh, we also did the blanket exercise a while back. It was really informative.
Thank you so much. Is it time? Okay. And time for one more question. Who's going to be the lucky one? Oh, Sharon, hang on. Just taking me a minute. Yeah.
It wasn't a question. I just wanted to fill in on what happens in the Lambton area. In the Lambton County School Board, my grandchildren live 5 doors off of off of our reserve. It just blanked. They live 5 doors off. We have the most beautiful community center there that is right on the edge. And every day when they're doing something, the word goes out to the neighbors. Please bring your children. Please come learn. So our children, it's normal for them to just run down and play in the park. They ride on the school bus all together, and they have a powwow at the college every year, and all of the public school children are taken to the powwow to take part, and it's an exciting, exciting time for them. My grandson is in grade 5, and he is taking Indigenous Studies right now, and he's just beside himself. He's so excited because living so close, they take part in what happens. So yes, it's there. Our college has a wonderful Indigenous center. We have a lovely daycare where everyone has been welcomed when there's no daycare for other children, our Indigenous daycare has welcomed the children that need daycare. And both of my goddaughter's children work there, and it's just an amazing place. It's beautiful. So it's happening. It's slow, but it's happening. And it's becoming very aware. And our children are starting to appreciate the culture.
Thank you. Just quick about education and the system. I think it needs to change. Oh, sorry. Or just saying the system, the education system needs to change to include the Indigenous worldview. It's very, very important. Our ways of knowing were spiritual. So when we dance, it's not just a skill of dance and how you step. It's a spiritual thing. You're dancing in thanksgiving to your ancestors, because without our ancestors, we wouldn't be here. We're dancing in thanksgiving to the Creator. So when people do our dances, even the white people that dance with our dances have testimonies of healing. One was a Mennonite lady who said when she started powwow dancing, she was able to conquer her addiction to alcohol. And she became a social worker, and she became one of our teachers for our kids. And when you're doing music, when you're doing drumming, some of our non-native friends in Tawasin wanted us to do a drumming workshop. So they were thinking beat, they were thinking music, skill of it. But when we asked the elder to come and teach, he told stories. He said, this is what this means to us. These are our songs, and this is what they mean to us. It's not just a song. It's not just a beat. And yes, there are different beats for different things, for celebrations, for funerals, all kinds of different beats. But there's a lot more to it, because our ways of knowing have been spiritual, and this is what an elder told me. We don't, and I think that's what's wrong with the world, and maybe this is the way that Indigenous people can actually help the church, is bring that spiritual aspect of life, because there's the four selves, and we just live on three of them in the world. We forget the spiritual, and I think that's what's happening with our earth. Nobody prays anymore. Everybody thinks we're our own God, we're our own selves, we don't need God, and all those things that go with it. But when in connection with education, we're presently working. I'm the convener of the National Indigenous Ministries Council of the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and includes the 8 Indigenous ministries of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. And so what we're doing right now is working with Tim Purvis to develop an Indigenous pathways to a Master Divinity, or at least to some kind of training that will allow for ordination of Indigenous people, because we don't have any Indigenous people in a church, in the Presbyterian Church especially. Now, the United Church had a way, they trained their people. Anglicans did the same. They have a whole bunch of Native leaders. They don't have their NDiv, but then they don't either pay them either, So they work, and they tell them Paul didn't get paid, so they have to get their own job, and then they, in order to survive, and then they go send them into, do the ministry with their own people on their own expense. United Church, I don't know exactly what they've done, but they seem to have a lot of Indigenous leaders. Presbyterian Church has not had Indigenous leaders, and continuing, we're too few. And like the 4 of us that are among the Indigenous leaders of our Native ministries who are Indigenous, the rest are not. So we need leaders. I need somebody to take over for me. Stuart needs someone to take over for him. In Winnipeg, they have 2 ministries there that need leadership. Yeah, with Margaret Mullen, and we need leadership, and we need you to pray for us with that. We're looking at a new way. That's the only way, because the church is not part of our system originally, and we have now been included. So I'm really so encouraged by what you're doing and all your work. I can feel it. I can see it. That you are sincere about wanting to do something. And one of those is education. Even in the educational system, the young lady that talked in the back is, you know, I was a grade 7 teacher for 1 year because they needed a Cree teacher. And I went, and then I was in between because I studied at Vancouver School of Theology every second year for 6 years because I couldn't go full time. And during that time, I had to teach 1 year in Northern Alberta. And one of the things that I learned is that I had 7 special needs kids in that class. Grade 7, anybody know what grade 7s are like? Well, I had to handle that. Had no support from the principal. He's Ukrainian. He didn't want anything to do with Indigenous culture, which was a shame because he was working in the principal of in a reserve in Northern Alberta. And they called me and told me I wasn't the team. I didn't do teamwork very well because I was trying to lead them away to include our kids. So what I did was I made a treaty with my kids. I told them about the Iroquois Confederacy, and that's something you guys can find out about too. The Great Peacemaker. Find out about the history and the contributions of Indigenous people. Those kids excelled in science because the book, at the end of each chapter, talked a little bit about Indigenous contributions to science and to different things. And so everything that connected them, they excelled at. And I had to teach them history too, and we came to teaching things like the history of Japan. Oh my God, they were bored. They couldn't make, and I didn't know how to connect them. And I go, how am I going to, well, other than they're kind of the same color, you know, but it just, you know, it's hard as a teacher to connect kids you got to connect their hearts because they're spiritual people. You got to connect their heart, not just their brain. You guys, the Caucasian people, you guys got the intellect, but we have the spiritual gifts. And so they're, you know, the elders know a lot more about that stuff than I do, but really encouraged that I think something's going to happen with the education system because more and more people are talking about it. Because your kids, just because they can't learn to read and write, there's a way, because it's a holistic way of teaching. A more holistic way of teaching, I think, would work. And also now that the colonial mind is kind of fading away, we hope we can maybe come to that place of peace and work together, not only as Indigenous people, but the whole community of this earth. Otherwise, we're not going to survive. So, thank you.
Just as we're going to break for lunch, I'm going to point out these are at the registration table. First one is the National Indigenous Ministries Council that we pulled off the PCC website. The second is your Reconciliation to ReconciliACTION resources brochure. We've got a list of books. There's many, many more. Your public libraries. We've got the library display out in the main foyer there. Please take a look and go through those books. There's a lot of online courses that don't charge anything. All you have to do is go online and they will teach. And I'm now going to call on Reverend Andrew Thompson to say the blessing.
Okay, let us pray. Gracious Creator, we thank you for these times of sharing the stories of Indigenous peoples, and we thank you for the opportunity to gather together to share a meal with one another and to break bread. We pray that you would continue to nurture us as we continue to share and reflect upon what we've heard, so we can go from reconciliation to ReconciliACTION. Pray that you would bless this food for our bodies. In Jesus' name, amen.
If we can be back here, we go downstairs for lunch. If we can be back here by, say, 1:30 in the main foyer, we're going to gather. Okay?